The Midnight Visit, a novel by Carlos Michael Padilla. Prologue, the kiss that woke the world. The house was quiet before the collapse, and yet everything loud was already happening. Voices Matthew couldn't explain, silences Lucas couldn't decode, distance Joseph couldn't outrun. And Daniel? He just loved them through it. Before the diagnosis, before the letter, before the haloed waffle that made Alejandro weep into his coffee. This is not the story of perfect people. It's the story of a father who baked hope into cinnamon rolls and children who learned, long after the laughter faded, that love never really sleeps. Even in silence, Daniel was listening. Even when faith felt faint, Matthew kept whispering. And when the midnight came, so did the miracle.
Chapter 1, December Light, page 8. 1 year earlier, the countryside east of Friendship wore winter like a homespun quilt. The farm wasn't much to look at. 2 acres of stubborn soil, a few chickens who refused to cooperate, and a tractor that coughed like a choir of elderly men arguing about the weather. But inside the small farmhouse on Ridge Hill Road, warmth lived. Matthew sat in the living room, fingers gently tracing a chipped ceramic nativity scene. Mary's face was smudged with glue from an old repair job. Baby Jesus had an oversized head, painted with devotion but little precision. He smiled. His dad, Daniel, had decorated early this year. The windows wore tinsel like old memories. The coffee shop downtown smelled of nutmeg and stories, and his younger brother Lucas, always somewhere between practical and poetic, had strung popcorn garland across the mantel, if only to distract himself from finals at the local college. Matthew was 23, but time felt slippery. He carried years inside him that didn't always show. His thoughts sometimes wandered slowly, like butterflies unsure of where to land. Autism shaped the way he moved through the world, and he moved gently. His arrival 2 months ago had been quiet. No balloons, just a hug from Dad so long it stitched something back together. Lucas had offered a nod and a mumble. "Glad you're here. Just don't steal my socks." They'd laughed. They'd settled. They'd built routines around the chickens and the coffee shop and the weather. But sometimes, when the wind blew against the porch like it wanted inside, Matthew would whisper to himself, "I think I belong here." And in those moments, he really did. Chapter 2, Seeds of Stillness, page 9. Mornings on the farm east of Friendship started before the sun did. Roosters liked to miscalculate their alarms. Frost clung to the truck windshield like unspoken memories, and coffee began brewing in the shop downtown just as the barn door creaked open, welcoming another day that didn't care what yesterday had cost. Matthew sat at the kitchen table, sipping slowly from a mismatched mug that read, "You are brutiful," in fading script. His fingers curled around the warm ceramic like it held steadiness, which, in a way, it did. Dad was already gone, likely prepping the dough for cinnamon rolls and the raisin pecan loaves the regulars always asked for but never finished. Lucas sat nearby, textbook open but eyes glazed. College was generous with its vocabulary and ruthless with its deadlines. "You doing okay?" Lucas asked, voice clipped but not cold. Matthew nodded, then reached for the sugar. 1 spoonful, 2, pause, 3. Lucas raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Later that day, they rode into town together. Lucas behind the wheel, Matthew in the passenger seat tracing frost patterns on the window with his pinky. The world outside flickered between brown and silver as if autumn hadn't finished its story but winter was rushing the plot. The coffee shop was tucked between a bait shop and a hardware store that smelled of dust and devotion. Daniel's Coffee and Crumb had been around for 6 years, born from grief and grace. After the divorce, after the moving boxes, after 100 sleepless nights, Dad had decided to bake healing into biscuits and serve warmth by the cup. Matthew loved it there. The walls were lined with postcards and black and white photos, some strangers, some relatives, all anchored to moments that didn't require context. The back counter held a register that Dad refused to update, a tip jar shaped like a boot, and a calendar stuck on April from 2 years ago. Customers trickled in. Teachers, truckers, a retired poet who quoted Emily Dickinson over blueberry scones. Dad greeted each with the same rhythm. "Morning, friend. Light roast or bold courage?" And they always smiled. Because Daniel spoke like someone who believed people were worth something, even on their worst days. Matthew helped stock shelves, refilled napkin holders, hummed quietly. He didn't always track conversations, but he tracked tone. He knew when someone was hurting, knew when Dad was tired beneath the grin, knew when Lucas needed silence more than words. One afternoon, a regular named Tom asked Matthew about his favorite Christmas memory. Matthew blinked, then said, "I remember my mom singing to me when I was little." I think the lights on the tree matched her voice. Tom stared for a moment, then whispered, "That's the most beautiful answer I've heard all year." By week's end, Matthew began settling into his own rhythm. He liked walking through the woods behind the farm, feet crunching leaves, mind playing soft imaginary music. He sometimes spoke aloud to trees, and if they listened, they never said so. At night, Lucas took the couch. Dad left the door to Matthew's room slightly ajar, just in case. "And Matthew?" He whispered prayers in his own cadence. "God, thank you for my mug, and my boots, and Dad's raisin bread. I don't know what I'm supposed to be, but thank you for letting me be here." December melted into soft uncertainty. Matthew didn't know what the future held. Dad didn't know how long the peace would last. Lucas didn't know how to prepare for what couldn't be studied. But for now, the coffee was warm. The farm was quiet. And love lingered, like cinnamon in the air, like a light that refused to flicker. Chapter 3. October. Whispers. Page 11. The trees east of Friendship wore their colors like they knew something was coming. Rust red, patient amber, yellow that looked more like caution than celebration. October had arrived, not with chill, but with quiet. At first, it was nothing. A pause mid-sentence, a strange glance toward an empty corner of the room. Matthew, sitting on the porch swing, listening to wind that didn't speak, mumbled something that didn't quite land. "Did you say something?" Daniel asked, pouring coffee into a chipped thermos. Matthew blinked. Number I was just answering a question. "There wasn't one, son." Matthew smiled faintly. "It wasn't yours." Daniel's hand slowed at the thermos, but he said nothing. The first time the voice came loudly was 2 weeks later. Matthew had been feeding the chickens, humming his own tune, when he froze, corn scoop hovering midair. He turned wide-eyed to Lucas. "Did you hear that?" Lucas looked up from his phone. "Hear what?" "The man, he was shouting. He said it's coming." Then softer. "He said I'm part of it." Lucas stood slowly, confusion flickering into concern. "Matthew, there's no one here but us." Matthew frowned, shook his head like someone trying to erase something from inside. "But I heard it." By the third week of October, the voices had patterns. They came mostly in the evenings. Sometimes Matthew laughed at them. Sometimes he cried. Sometimes he covered his ears and whispered, "Go away." Daniel tried everything. Walks at dusk, hoping fresh air might silence whatever was rising. Long conversations filled with love and memory. Journaling prompts like, if the voice were a storm, what kind of rain would it bring? Sometimes they helped. Sometimes they didn't. Lucas kept his distance, mostly offering rides and errands when asked. But his eyes avoided his brothers. And Joseph? Absent. Not cruel, just unavailable. There was tension between Lucas and Joseph. Unsaid, unspoken, unresolved. Every time Daniel mentioned inviting Joseph for help, Lucas would tighten his jaw and say, You know how that'll go." Daniel did. He carried both sons differently, not equally, just honestly. And it was exhausting. At night, Daniel didn't sleep much. He'd leave the door to Matthew's room cracked, listening for pacing footsteps or sudden sobs. He kept a Bible on the counter, open to Psalms, but he hadn't read it in days. It wasn't disbelief, just fatigue. That strange spiritual numbness that comes when faith is real. But so is reality. The bakery still opened at 6. The farm still needed tending, and the voices in Matthew's head weren't waiting for anyone's convenience. One evening, Matthew came into the kitchen and whispered, "Do you think I'm bad?" Daniel dropped his coffee spoon into the sink. "No, son, never." Matthew nodded. "They said I'm the problem." Daniel knelt in front of him, placed both hands on Matthew's trembling shoulders, and said, "You're not the problem. You're the reason we keep going. The voices don't know your heart. I do." Matthew blinked, then hugged his father, tightly, wordlessly, like he was afraid that if he let go, the truth would leave with him. As October wound down, Daniel began sketching plans. He called a crisis care center in Tulsa, scheduled evaluations, spoke to professionals with voices like clipped compassion. His ex-wife remained distant and firm. "You need to take him to that facility near Springfield," she said for the 5th time. Daniel rubbed the bridge of his nose. "That facility doesn't offer anything different. It's further away," she snapped. "Sometimes distance helps." Daniel didn't respond, because there was nothing to say that hadn't already cost him enough. On Halloween morning, Matthew didn't come out of his room. Lucas peeked in once, came back out and said, "He's under the bed, won't talk." Daniel walked in slowly, knelt beside the bed frame, and whispered, "You don't have to come out yet, but when you're ready, I'll be here. We're going to figure this out, together." A few moments later, fingers reached for Daniel's hand from under the blankets. They held on, softly, desperately. That night, as leaves drifted like forgotten prayers across the porch, Daniel lit a candle in the living room, not for ambiance, for intention. He whispered to the flame, "Help me hold what I cannot fix. Help me love what I don't yet understand. Help me remember that this is holy work, even when it hurts." Then he sat beside it, alone, exhausted, and faithful still. Chapter 4. Crisis Care and Coffee Breaks, page 14. The first week of November arrived dressed in gray. Not the dramatic storm gray, just the soft kind that lingers, like a sigh you forget you're holding. Daniel sat in the small office of the Crisis Care Center just outside Tulsa. It smelled of printer paper and worn hope. Across from him, a counselor named Mrs. Farrell took notes with quiet eyes and gentle hands. She didn't rush, didn't dismiss. And when Daniel explained how the voices had grown louder, how Matthew stopped sleeping, how the joy had thinned beneath the weight of worry, she nodded, deeply, repeatedly. "Let's start with assessment. Let's build a plan. Let's remind Matthew, and you, that you're not alone." It was the first time in weeks Daniel felt something beneath exhaustion, support. Back at the farmhouse, Lucas scrubbed dishes harder than necessary. The silence between him and Matthew was no longer casual, it was cautious. Matthew had begun speaking in codes, sentences strung together like puzzles only he could solve. "The birds know more than we think," he whispered once, staring out the window. "They told me Dad shouldn't bake on Wednesdays. It's a trap." Lucas blinked, unsure whether to laugh, reply, or leave. He chose silence. That night, Daniel returned home with pamphlets, names, emergency numbers. Matthew sat on the porch swing, cradling a jar of honey and murmuring to it like a confidant. Daniel eased down beside him. "Hey, bud, you okay?" Matthew didn't look up. "They said sweetness might help. I think the jar understands better than you." Daniel nodded slowly. "Well, the jar hasn't lived with you for 23 years, but I'm willing to learn." Diagnosis came on the second Thursday of the month. Words like autism, spectrum disorder, and schizoaffective tendencies entered their world like uninvited guests. Daniel didn't cry. Not at first. He asked questions, took notes, scheduled follow-ups, but deep down something bruised. Not because he didn't love Matthew, but because love didn't cancel helplessness. That night in the kitchen, Lucas spoke without looking up from his phone. "Are we supposed to know how to do this?" Daniel stared at him, shook his head. "No one does, but we do it anyway." At the coffee shop, regulars began noticing Daniel's fatigue. Tom offered to help sweep. Mrs. Beasley, 83 and full of unsolicited wisdom, said, "Your eyes look like a worn hymn, dear. Find some rest before life finds it for you." Daniel smiled, baked extra rolls, wrote encouraging notes on napkins with Sharpie. "You're seen. You're strong. You're welcome here." Because if the world outside their walls kept spinning, he'd at least ensure it tasted like cinnamon and kindness. One afternoon, Matthew broke into sobs behind the register counter. "I can hear them fighting," he said. "There are two Matthews. One wants to sleep. The other wants to disappear." Daniel held him, tight, firm. "You're one soul, and you're ours, no matter what the voices say." Lucas watched from the doorway, and for the first time in weeks he whispered, "Do you want me to pick up your prescription tomorrow?" It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was love, willing to take a step. Meanwhile, Joseph remained distant, texts unanswered, calls brief. Daniel knew better than to push. The tension between Joseph and Lucas had taken root long ago, some brotherly breach no one could name but everyone felt. Still, Daniel grieved it. Not with anger, just sorrow, because Matthew needed both brothers, and Daniel? He needed someone to carry him. One night, after Matthew had finally slept and Lucas had retreated to his room, Daniel sat at the kitchen table and wrote the words he couldn't say aloud. "God, I don't need a miracle. I need endurance. I need my sons to see each other again. I need to stop feeling like a failure because I'm tired. And I need Matthew to know his mind doesn't define his worth." He folded the note, tucked it into the cookie jar, and went to bed with tears that didn't ask for permission. Chapter 5. Sleepless Prayers, page 17. Sleep became a memory, not lost, just suspended, like an ornament still packed away after the season passed, waiting for permission to shine again. The farmhouse felt heavier at night, colder too, despite Lucas's attempts to crank the heater and pile blankets like fortresses. Matthew had started pacing after midnight, sometimes humming to himself, sometimes muttering phrases that looped like vinyl scratched by worry. Daniel kept vigil, a father not trained in psychology, not fluent in medical jargon, just love. And love doesn't demand credentials. One night, Matthew stood in the hallway for over an hour. He stared at the family photos, his father in a flannel shirt holding a newborn version of himself, Joseph with missing teeth and muddy jeans, Lucas holding a frog in triumph, unsure whether to keep it or baptize it. Matthew whispered to the wall, "They're watching me, but they're not saying anything." Daniel sat nearby on a kitchen chair, slippers on, coffee cooling beside him. He didn't interrupt, didn't correct, just whispered back, "I'm here if you need me." Matthew turned. His eyes didn't carry fear. They carried weight. "I think I broke something inside." Daniel walked to him, placed a hand on his son's shoulder, squeezed gently. "Nothing's broken that can't be carried, and I'll help you hold it." Lucas grew quiet during these weeks, not detached, just muted. He worked his shifts at the college bookstore, helped with chores, but each interaction felt measured. He loved Matthew, no question. But the fear of being needed too deeply lived just beneath his skin, and when Daniel mentioned Joseph again, hoping for a thread between the brothers, Lucas cut him short. "Let it go, Dad. You know he won't come? He might. Even if he does, it won't change anything." The wound between them never exploded. It festered, like a sadness they inherited but never asked for. Daniel didn't push. He didn't have the energy to fight one silence while tending to another. Mid-November brought more visits to the crisis center. New medications, routines too fragile to predict. Matthew once said to his father while drawing circles on a napkin, "The pills make the voices softer. But sometimes they feel too soft, like maybe I'm disappearing." Daniel knelt beside him. "You're here. The quiet isn't your absence. It's your breath finding peace." Matthew blinked, then handed his father the napkin. On it, amidst the scattered circles, was one word scribbled in the corner, "Stay." Daniel folded it gently and placed it in his wallet. The coffee shop stayed open. Customers noticed Daniel's weariness. Mrs. Beasley began showing up twice a week with lemon bars and unsolicited prophecies. Tom added a third afternoon shift just to keep things flowing. The town, in its own understated way, held space for their neighbor's ache. One afternoon, Matthew wandered into the shop alone. He wore mismatched socks and had 2 pins behind his ears. He walked to the counter and said, "I'm helping today. I want the people to feel normal." Daniel nodded, tearful before he could hide it. Matthew wasn't cured, but he was present. And presence, that was holy. He poured coffee, handed out napkins, greeted a woman with, "Your sweater makes me think of kindness," and she wept. That night, Daniel sat on the porch. Cold air, blanket wrapped around tired knees. Sky full of the kind of stars that only show up when you're not looking. He prayed. Not in polished sentences, not in declarations of faith. Just a whisper. "God, thank you for tonight. I don't need tomorrow to be easier, just enough for us to keep walking." Then he rested his head against the back of the chair, just for a moment, enough to breathe, enough to believe.
Chapters 1 through 5. As the front porch light flickers once more and the silence of the midnight hour lingers between breaths and confessions, a subtle shift begins. Not in thunderous revelation, but in the soft, unseen stirrings of the heart. What was buried is awakening. What was fractured, searching for grace. And though the night holds its shadows, it also whispers of a dawn not yet claimed. The visit is far from over. Well, friends, that does it for this week. Please join us next Saturday for Chapter 6 through 10. Chapter 6, The Diagnosis and the Diner. Chapter 7, When the Caregiver Breaks. Chapter 8, Overheard. Chapter 9, Gone but Not Leaving. Chapter 10, Breadcrumbs of Grace. Until next weekend, on behalf of Carlos Michael Padilla, Carlos Michael Communications Media, the Carlos Michael Studio, and Coffee House Productions, my name is Alejandro Armando Armand. God bless.